Picture yourself as a wealthy merchant in Renaissance Florence, invited to witness what you believe will be a grand spectacle of royal justice. The year is 1478, and you've received a gilded invitation bearing the seal of Lorenzo de' Medici himself. As you climb the stone steps of the Palazzo Vecchio, your silk robes rustling against the ancient marble, you expect to see a simple hanging, or perhaps a swift beheading. After all, these are civilized times, the age of art, literature, and human enlightenment. But as you enter the courtyard, something feels wrong. The air is thick with tension, and the gathered nobles whisper nervously among themselves. Their faces aren't filled with the casual indifference you'd expect at a routine execution. Instead, you see genuine fear in their eyes. The wooden platform in the centre isn't equipped with a simple gallows or executioner's block. Instead, there's an elaborate contraption of gears, pulleys, and gleaming metal that looks more like a work of engineering genius than an instrument of death. That's when it hits you. You're not here to witness justice. You're here to witness art, twisted, horrifying art designed by a mind that sees human suffering as the ultimate canvas for creative expression. The Renaissance didn't just give us masterpieces of painting and sculpture. It gave us rulers who turned execution into performance, death into spectacle, and human agony into entertainment for the masses. Before diving into these forgotten stories of power and cruelty, if you enjoy learning about the darker truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with humanity's capacity for both brilliance and brutality. To understand how Renaissance monarchs transformed execution from simple punishment into elaborate theatre, you have to understand the world they inhabited. This wasn't the medieval period, where death was often crude and immediate. The Renaissance was an era obsessed with innovation, artistic expression, and demonstrating superiority through increasingly sophisticated displays of power. Kings and princes competed not just through military conquest or architectural marvels, but through the sheer creativity of their cruelty. These weren't random acts of violence born from momentary rage. They were carefully planned performances, designed months in advance by teams of engineers, artists, and craftsmen who approached human execution with the same meticulous attention they might give to designing a cathedral or painting a fresco. The goal wasn't simply to kill, it was to create an experience so memorable, so psychologically devastating, that it would be talked about for generations. The rulers of Renaissance Europe understood something that modern leaders often forget. True power isn't just about having the ability to end someone's life. It's about demonstrating that ability in ways so creative, so unexpected, that your subjects begin to see you as something beyond human, a force of nature capable of turning death itself into art. Consider the mechanical marvels that began appearing in execution squares across Italy, France, and Germany during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. These weren't the simple devices of earlier eras. They were complex machines that incorporated the same engineering principles being used to design watermills, clockwork mechanisms, and architectural wonders. Renaissance kings commissioned master craftsmen to create execution devices that would function as both instruments of death and demonstrations of technological superiority. One particularly ingenious creation involved a series of interlocking gears that would slowly rotate the condemned person through various positions while applying graduated pressure to different parts of their body. The victim would experience every possible angle of agony, while the assembled crowd watched in fascination at the mechanical precision of their suffering. These machines weren't designed for efficiency, they were designed for spectacle, turning a simple execution into an hours-long performance that combined the precision of Renaissance engineering with the psychological terror of absolute power. The artistic element was equally important. Renaissance rulers didn't just want their subjects to fear death, they wanted them to appreciate the aesthetic beauty of the execution process. Elaborate stages were constructed, featuring painted backdrops, sculptural elements, and carefully choreographed movements that turned the condemned person's final moments into a carefully directed performance piece. Costumes played a crucial role in these productions. The executioner wasn't simply a hooded figure with an axe. He was a performer dressed in specially designed robes that incorporated symbolic elements, reflecting the nature of the condemned person's crimes. The victim might be required to wear specific colours or garments that added layers of meaning to their death, turning their execution into a complex narrative that educated the audience about the consequences of defying royal authority. Music was another element that distinguished Renaissance executions from their medieval predecessors. Court musicians would compose special pieces designed to accompany different phases of the execution process. The psychological impact of hearing beautiful, carefully crafted melodies while witnessing horrific violence created a cognitive dissonance that made the experience even more memorable and traumatic for observers. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of these Renaissance execution spectacles was their use of symbolism and allegory. These weren't random displays of violence, they were carefully constructed narratives that used the condemned person's death to tell larger stories about power, justice, and the divine right of kings to determine life and death. A merchant convicted of fraud might find himself executed using a device that incorporated scales and weights, with his death serving as a literal demonstration of justice being balanced. A military traitor could face execution through a machine designed to mimic the movements of battle, with mechanical arms wielding swords or spears in precisely choreographed patterns that told the story of his betrayal through motion and violence. The timing of these executions was equally calculated. Renaissance rulers understood that the psychological impact of their displays would be magnified if they coincided with religious festivals, seasonal celebrations, or significant political events. An execution held during a harvest festival would carry different symbolic weight than one conducted during Lent, and skilled royal advisors knew exactly how to maximize the educational and intimidating value of each death. The audience participation element of Renaissance executions represented another significant evolution from earlier practices. Rather than simply watching passively, crowds were encouraged to engage with the spectacle through carefully orchestrated responses. They might be required to chant specific phrases at predetermined moments, or to participate in ritualistic actions that made them complicit in the condemned person's death. This psychological manipulation served multiple purposes. It created a shared experience that bonded the community around the ruler's demonstration of power, while simultaneously making each observer feel personally involved in the execution process. When people actively participate in violence, they become psychologically invested in justifying that violence, making them less likely to question the ruler's authority in the future. The technological innovations didn't end with the execution devices themselves. Renaissance courts developed sophisticated methods for preserving and displaying the results of their creative executions. Special preservation techniques kept bodies or body parts in viewable condition for extended periods, turning the aftermath of execution into ongoing displays of royal power. Some rulers commissioned artists to create detailed paintings or sculptures depicting their most innovative executions, ensuring that the memory of their creative cruelty would outlast the physical evidence. These artistic commemorations served as permanent reminders of what happened to those who challenged royal authority, while simultaneously celebrating the aesthetic and technical achievements of the execution process. The international dimension of Renaissance execution innovation created a kind of arms race of cruelty among European rulers. Kings and princes would send ambassadors to observe each other's executions, taking notes on particularly effective techniques, or impressive technological innovations. This diplomatic exchange of execution methods meant that the most successful innovations would spread rapidly across European courts, with each ruler attempting to outdo their rivals through increasingly elaborate displays. The documentation of these events became an art form in itself. Court scribes would compose detailed accounts that read more like reviews of theatrical performances than simple records of legal proceedings. These documents described not just what happened, but how the audience reacted, which technical elements were most effective, and how the overall spectacle compared to previous executions. But the true genius of Renaissance execution artistry lay in its psychological sophistication. These rulers understood that the most effective displays of power weren't necessarily the most physically brutal. They were the ones that created the deepest psychological impact on observers. An execution that left people talking, wondering, and psychologically unsettled for months afterward was infinitely more valuable than one that simply killed quickly and efficiently. The creative minds behind these spectacles studied human psychology with the same intensity that their contemporaries studied anatomy or astronomy. They understood how to manipulate fear, curiosity, and morbid fascination to create experiences that would reshape how people thought about authority, rebellion, and the consequences of challenging royal power. The legacy of these Renaissance execution innovations extended far beyond their immediate political purposes. They established patterns of state-sponsored spectacle that would influence public displays of power for centuries to come. More importantly, they revealed something fundamental about human nature: our capacity to transform even the most basic acts of violence into elaborate expressions of creativity and control. The craftsmen who designed these devices often went on to apply their skills to more conventional projects. The same engineer who created a mechanically complex execution machine might later design irrigation systems or architectural marvels. This cross-pollination of skills meant that the technical innovations developed for killing were often repurposed for building, creating an odd legacy where instruments of death contributed to the broader technological advancement of Renaissance society. The psychological impact on the craftsmen themselves was profound and often overlooked. These were skilled artisans, masters of their trades, who found themselves creating devices whose sole purpose was human suffering. Many left behind personal writings that reveal the internal conflict between professional pride in their technical achievements and moral horror at their ultimate purpose. Some sought absolution through religious devotion, while others justified their work as serving a higher purpose of maintaining social order. The economic dimension of these elaborate executions was staggering. A single innovative execution could cost more than building a small church or maintaining a military garrison for a year. The expense wasn't just in materials and labour, it included payments to artists, musicians, costume designers, and even special food vendors who catered to the crowds. These events became major economic enterprises that involved hundreds of people and generated significant revenue for local communities. The international observers who attended these executions often returned to their home countries with detailed sketches and descriptions that influenced their own rulers' approach to public punishment. This created a kind of cultural exchange program centered around creative cruelty, with diplomatic missions specifically dedicated to studying and reporting on foreign execution techniques. The most successful innovations would be adapted and modified to suit local customs and available resources. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these Renaissance execution spectacles was how completely they normalized extreme violence within the context of artistic achievement. Audiences learned to appreciate technical skill and creative innovation even when applied to human suffering. This psychological conditioning made it easier for these societies to accept other forms of systematic cruelty and oppression. The documentation that survives from this period reveals how thoroughly these events were integrated into the social and cultural fabric of Renaissance life. Children grew up attending executions as educational experiences. Merchants planned business trips around famous executions. Artists studied these events for inspiration in their own work. What should have been horrifying aberrations became routine elements of civic life. The decline of these elaborate execution practices came not from moral awakening, but from practical considerations. The expense became prohibitive as European kingdoms faced increasing financial pressures from warfare and exploration. The time and resources required to plan and execute these spectacles began to seem wasteful when rulers needed to focus on more immediate threats to their power. Additionally, the rise of printing technology meant that rulers could communicate their power and authority through written propaganda rather than public spectacles. A pamphlet describing an execution could reach far more people than the actual event, making the elaborate staging less necessary for achieving the desired psychological impact. The Protestant Reformation also played a role in ending these practices. Religious reformers criticized the theatrical elements of public executions as inappropriate mixing of sacred and profane elements. They argued that death should be approached with solemnity rather than artistic creativity, and that excessive focus on the spectacle distracted from the spiritual significance of a person's final moments. Modern historians studying these events face unique challenges in documenting and understanding them. The surviving records were often written by court officials who had every incentive to exaggerate the creativity and effectiveness of their rulers' execution methods. Separating fact from propaganda requires careful analysis of multiple sources and understanding of the political motivations behind each account. The psychological legacy of Renaissance execution artistry can still be observed in modern society's complicated relationship with violence as entertainment. Our fascination with true crime, horror films, and detailed news coverage of violent events reflects the same human tendencies that made these historical spectacles so effective at capturing and holding public attention. Understanding these historical practices helps us recognize how easily societies can normalize extreme violence when it's presented within frameworks of art, technology, or social necessity. The Renaissance rulers who pioneered these techniques weren't necessarily more cruel than their predecessors. They were simply more creative in applying their cruelty and more sophisticated in understanding its psychological impact. The merchants, nobles, and common citizens who attended these executions weren't inherently evil people. They were individuals living within social systems that had gradually conditioned them to accept increasingly extreme displays of violence as normal and even admirable expressions of royal power. Their participation reminds us how social pressure and cultural conditioning can make almost anyone complicit in systematic cruelty. These forgotten stories from Renaissance Europe serve as warnings about the dangers of allowing power to become performance, justice to become entertainment, and human suffering to become art. They remind us that some of history's most horrific innovations came not from savage barbarians, but from highly educated, culturally sophisticated societies that had lost sight of fundamental human dignity in their pursuit of ever more impressive displays of authority. The gilded invitation that brought our fictional merchant to witness Lorenzo de' Medici's execution spectacle represents more than just a single historical moment. It symbolizes how easily we can be drawn into participating in or witnessing cruelty when it's presented within familiar social frameworks and justified by appealing to higher purposes. As we reflect on these dark chapters of human creativity, we must ask ourselves what invitations we accept today and what spectacles we attend without fully considering their deeper implications for human dignity and social justice.